A very warm welcome to all of you. We now come to the second part of the lecture of gender in migration studies. So, in this part of the lecture, we begin with looking at the various levels at which gender can be seen in migration research, or gender as a social phenomena can be seen. Right. So, we have let's start with talking about the micro level. Right. So, the micro level largely refers to the individuals or households and so on, and we focus on individual practices, individual identities and individual positions, right. And then you have the macro level. The macro level could be at the level of the state, the level of the nation state. You could be looking at policies and laws and so on. And then, so therefore, the labor market segmentation is one aspect which can, where gendered social phenomena can be studied at the macro level, and the meso level is in between, right. So, it could be a community level, it could be you trying to understand community level dynamics or even village level dynamics or social networks. These all are examples of meso level, right. The meso level or the meso level between the micro and the macro level, right. And we can also look at, when we are talking of analytical levels, we can also look at spatial scales, right. So, the local, national, global, each scale is different. Each scale has various social processes which are going on, has various issues that can be studied, and then we can, like I've been mentioning, when you look at it through a gendered lens, you can unpack gender in migration studies through each one of these scales, right. So, for instance, looking at it very broadly, we know that migrants tend to live in transnational families, right, and they reconcile work and family life home, right. So, they have work abroad and family life home, and therefore, how is it that a migrant's position in the transnational social space is marked by class, ethnicity, is something that we can study at the individual level when we're looking at migrant experiences and so on. But at the same time, if there are laws, if there are policies that lead to certain kinds of outcomes, then that level will be more a macro level, right. So, other individual level variables can be age, education, individual skills or ability, which might be an outcome or of your economic resources and so on, right. And similarly, at the macro level, laws, policies, labor market functions, regulation, state regulation, all of these are macro level variables. And meso level variables will be those in between the macro and micro. So, community, social networks. Now, these are and these can be very gendered, right. And the idea is then, within each level, we try to understand how gender works in the migratory process. And like, for instance, we discussed how labor markets can be very gendered, right. So, you have labor markets that can be gendered, organizations can be gendered, and care practices can be gendered. So, all of these are therefore very, very important lenses through which gender operates in migration. And the other thing is that we need to, for theory, it's important that we integrate gender aspects to theory. So, theory is often gender blind, and like for several decades now, there has been an awareness of the feminization of migration. We know that gender operates in very many ways. We know this empirically. So, therefore, it's really important that gendered aspects of theory, whether it's in transnational migration, whether it's in labor market, whether it's in social networks, it's very important that we integrate gendered aspects in theory, right. And then what is also very important is that once we start looking at the theories of migration, and we've seen theories, neoclassical theories of new economics of labor migration, gender is not explicitly integrated in any of these theories, right? The minute we start incorporating gender into these theories, then we realize that we might actually need to reframe our migration theories, right? For instance, very briefly, in neoclassical theory, it's very individual centric, where man is a rational actor. But the minute you realize that, migration, the motivation to migration is for the family, then like the new economics of labor migration does, but yet it doesn't incorporate gender, is for the family. And so the main motivation for migration is not to have a higher income, but actually to have a better life, to improve your life's chances, to provide for a better life for your children. So the minute you kind of look beyond economic motives and, portraying migrant as a homo economicus, right? It's important to look beyond these motives, right? And the minute we do that, then we realize that, you can translate everything to a cost, but this economic reductionism, reducing everything to economics, actually takes us away from migrants' gender, their gendered obligations, their care responsibilities, their family loyalties, family ties, all of this which are very closely related to migration motivations, but somehow they are not theorized seriously enough in the literature. Let us now come to research and methods related to gender in migration studies. Broadly, you have quantitative methods and qualitative methods. You also have mixed methods, which are a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. So the most common quantitative method is surveys, to collect survey data, right? Now, what does survey data helps us estimate migration? It helps us determine the characteristics of migrants, patterns of migration, and so on, right? So, to estimate migration, we also need to collect data from non-migrants, right? Non-migrant households, non-migrant individuals, and so on. Then you have ethnography and participant observation. These are largely qualitative methods, and which are very useful in the disciplines of sociology, in the disciplines of anthropology, and so on. And then archival research is largely done in history, and it's a very useful method in trying to understand, unpacking migration of a particular time period. So it has the temporal dimension and so on, right? The other thing is that, like we've been talking about, looking at everything from a gendered lens. So when we look at things from a gendered lens, when we do gendered analysis, it's a subjective process, and it becomes associated with discursive analysis. So then that critiques positivist methodologies, that critiques structuralist methodologies. And of course, we do need exclusive studies on men and women. We're not saying that that's not important, but we also need to understand the relational aspects, understand the relational aspects of gender and apply this to migration, right? And so migrants often become very aware of the relational, of the contextual nature of gender as they are trying to work at destination, as they are trying to fulfill their expectations, what is expected of them, as life might be very different at the place of destination and where they come from, right? And collectively as well, gender analysis is no longer focused on women, families, household. Instead, we need to look at the entire process of migration as a gendered phenomena, right? And when you do that, then various areas such as the politics and governance of migration, what's happening in the workplace, whether you have a neoliberal state or a welfare state, how do their policies towards migration may be gendered in a certain manner, how is it that the capitalist world system within which migration is anchored, how is that gendered? All of these then therefore become important components of gender analysis. So therefore the gender analysis, of course, the individual is an important unit, the family is an important unit, but macro, more meso and macro units of analysis are also very important to incorporate in any kind of a gender analysis in migration. And then there's the concept of gender geographies of power, and I'm going to come to this in a little while. So we now come to the role of ethnographers, and this is something which comes out very strongly in Mahler and Pesser's paper. And ethnography, so what is ethnography? We should just discuss that earlier. Ethnography primarily involves participant observation. It involves in-depth interviewing over the course of many months or years, principally largely by one ethnographer, right? So, so one of the main strengths of the ethnographic method is the ability not only to build upon previous observations, but also generate hypotheses from them, right? And therefore produce new research materials, ask new questions from ongoing observations, right? And so what Mahler and Pesser do is they take us through an epistemological framework for the feminist ethnographer, right? So when you're incorporating gender in your analysis, that makes you a feminist ethnographer. And they argue that one of the fundamental issues with quantitative data sets or quantitative approaches is that they are unable to contextualize data, right? Whereas ethnography, by virtue of its method, by virtue of its epistemology, it respects local knowledge, and therefore ethnographic research is able to incorporate new variables, right? So if you're studying something, typically positivist quantitative studies come with a questionnaire. You're already going with your questionnaire, which doesn't allow you to accommodate new things that you see in the field, whereas ethnography allows you to do that. You know, you see something in the field, you're able to incorporate that in your research design and so on. So, but one of the challenges that ethnographers face is that unlike quantitative researchers or unlike quantitative data, ethnographic data may not be able to be generalized, right? And may not be able to be generalized. But Mahler and Pesser says, you know what, that's fine. We're not here to generalize. We're fine. We are interested. We're not here to generalize. We're okay with small scale theory building, mid-range theory building. We don't wish to build grand narratives, right? And so within this context, ethnography is very useful for exploratory research. You can, there are questions that can be generated, which can later be examined more systematically, and then that can promote theorization later. At the same time, ethnography is reflexive, it's flexible, it's adaptable, it can change due to evolving research questions. And then you have the ethno-survey. What do we mean by the ethno-survey? So Massey, Douglas Massey, we've referred to Douglas Massey's work earlier in the class on social networks and several other theoretical classes. So ethno-survey is when you're doing an ethnography, but you're also doing a survey. One of the ways of accommodating some quant perspectives is to do an ethno-survey, where you have multi-method data collection, you're also doing a survey, you're also doing participant observation, you're also doing semi-structured interviews, and so therefore you can have somewhat representative sample in an ethno-survey. You can also incorporate life history collection and studies of migration. You can have data at multiple levels, and all of this then kind of helps in the rigor of research according to Massey. And then you can also have multi-sited ethnography, do ethnography in different sites and try to understand how migration might be similar or different and so on. Then the other very important method, a tool, is longitudinal research. Longitudinal research is when you study the same site, the same individuals, the same households, or whatever your unit of analysis is, over a period of time, right? So that allows you to study change that helps you in understand transformation question. And this is also it's a very rich way of understanding migration, how gendered processes in migration might change over time. So longitudinal research is very useful for that. I want to speak a little more about disciplinarity, right? So what Mala and Pesser do is they argue that, okay, ethnographers can belong to any discipline. You could be a geographer, you could be a sociologist, you could be an anthropologist, you could be even an economist and be an ethnographer, right? So how is it? And they privilege ethnography as a method for all the reasons that we discussed. And while we're talking about this, it's also important to talk about a little bit about disciplinarity, right? So the first term here is intradisciplinarity. What do we mean by intradisciplinarity? When you work within a single discipline, that's intradisciplinarity. Then the second is cross-disciplinarity. What do we mean by cross-disciplinarity? When you view one discipline from the perspective of another discipline, that's cross-disciplinarity. Then the third is multidisciplinarity. What is meant by multidisciplinarity? When people from different disciplines are working together, each drawing on their disciplinary knowledge and coming together, that is multidisciplinarity. So you could have a research project where there's an economist, a sociologist, a psychologist, a historian, they're all working together, and then that is a multidisciplinary project, right? But how is multidisciplinarity different from interdisciplinarity? Now, interdisciplinarity is when you integrate the knowledge and methods from different disciplines and you synthesize it, right? So, not only is an economist and a sociologist working together, but they are also integrating their knowledge and methods, right? So, that is how multidisciplinarity is different from interdisciplinarity. And then the last is transdisciplinarity. What do we mean by transdisciplinarity? Transdisciplinarity is when you create a unity of intellectual framework beyond disciplinary perspective. So your entire framework, the framework of your research goes beyond disciplinary perspective. Very hard to do. So the other thing which is really important in Mala and Pesser's work is that gender is very important in shaping migrant households, kinship and social networks, right? And again, just the way gender was missing from migration research, gender was also missing from social networks. And think of it logically, and now we have enough empirical studies to show that male networks actually work very differently from female networks. And upon women's migration for wage work, you have various outcomes, right? So when women migrate for wage work, there's research that shows that there's gains in personal autonomy, in physical mobility, in independence. And there's also greater gender parity, men lose ground, and women have more say in decision making, finances, childcare when they migrate and bring in remittances. At the same time, research also shows that migration fosters more companionate spousal relationships. Men and women can have more companionate spousal relations due to migration. While we also have evidence showing that women's migration leads to an intensification of men's control over women and can lead to emotional and physical abuse. So you see these four outcomes that we see here, they are gendered, and these are the outcomes for women. For men, we know that outcomes of migration will not look like this. They will look different. And you can also see that these outcomes are not linear. The four outcomes that we just discussed, they are not linear and they are complex. And also that some of them are in tension with one another. And how is it that, how do changes in women's status as a result of migration, how is it that they affect masculine privilege? How is it that it interrelates with other challenges to men's self-esteem caused by racism, classism, religion, legal status? So all of that also matters, right? So therefore, the fundamental point I'm trying to make is that empirically we know that gender shapes migrant households, kinship, social networks, and how outcomes of women's work are very different, and some of them are listed here compared to outcomes of men's work when it comes to migration. So carrying on with our conversation on how gender shapes migrant households, kinship, and social networks. Therefore, the fundamental point is that individuals are tied to larger social units, right? And therefore, migration is not only a process which is economic and or political, but is also a socio-cultural process which is mediated by gendered ideologies, which is mediated by institutions and mediated by practices. So on the one hand, you have macro structural transformations, and because of which there might be pressures and incentives for migration. It is often households with families who then determine who will migrate, how a migrant's contribution and remittances will fit into the household economy, and so on. And how is it that households decide who will migrate and who will not migrate? Of course, we looked at the new economics of labor migration, which was all cooperation. So yeah, members could reach a consensus. There could be some altruism there, but members could also be in conflict with one another, right? And so households are also not only sites of cooperation, but also sites of conflict, and that also needs to be taken into account when we theorize migration and when we theorize gender and migration, because very often the conflict is between men and women in a household, right? And then when we look at it from that lens, then we become more aware of the hierarchies of power, right? So of course, gender is one axis of hierarchy, but in very many contexts, generation is another axis of hierarchy, right? So you have, especially in the Asian context, in the context of filial piety, you have the older generation, which is more powerful, which has more say compared to the younger generation, right? So you can see how both gender and generation also then play a role in household decisions and processes related to migration. The other point that Mahler and Pesser make is that children are gendered too. And for a long time, childhood and youth studies have been neglected in migration research. But increasingly, this is not so. There's a lot of scope for gendered work here, and we are seeing this gendered work. And so the first point is that adolescent boys and adolescent girls are treated very differently, right? And gender regimes, it's gender regimes which are fundamental in understanding why women are rooted at home and why women are not allowed to roam like boys. And this is also, the idea that adolescent girls they have to shoulder the family's reputation, they have to carry the reputation of the entire ethnic group that they belong to, the community they belong to. And you also have gendered cultures of migration. Now, why is it that it's only always young boys and young men who run away from home? Girls and young women never run away from home in migration literature and migration research and so on, right? The other thing which is really important is when it comes to children and young people is assimilation, right? So a lot of research, a lot of second generation research is very important. So we find that social networks, neighborhoods, schools, job opportunities, family arrangements, all of these are open to the second generation of migrants, and they are racialized, they are gendered. So assimilation is very different for second generation compared to the first generation. And it's only through differences in assimilation that transnationalism is also very different for first and second generation migrants, right? The other thing that we find in empirical research is that young children then behave in gender appropriate ways in different contexts. So because of biculturalism, multiculturalism in the destination regions, young children will practice the social norms of at home, which will be very different from the social norms at the school or in public and so on. So there's some research around this. And then there's also now a fair bit of research on gender in adoption. Adoption is also one kind of migration, right? And over here, there's an example of Chinese babies. So Mala and Pesa refer to the example of Chinese babies being adopted in the US, and again, this is also there are gender stereotypes that are used here. So girls are preferred for adoption because they seem to be easier to raise than boys. They're fun to dress up, and another explanation is that girls are safer to adopt. They are less likely to join gangs. And so therefore, international adoption also produces immigrants who have no choice in the matter, right? And so adoption can therefore be seen as deliberately induced migration, right? Because those who have migrated for adoption, the children, they have no choice in the matter. So then therefore, this comes with moral dilemmas, this comes with methodological dilemmas, and it's an important component of child migration. The other unit, as we've been discussing through the course of this course, is that how the nation state is a fundamental unit of analysis, right? And the nation state, its policies, these are all also very gendered, right? Who does the nation belong to? Does it belong to men? Does it belong to women? Does it belong to both equally? And so on. These are important questions to dwell on. And then within nation states, border control is an important area of research, right? And and we know that research, empirical research shows that women and girls are much more often targets of gender-based violence. There are suspicions around them, border crossing for prostitution and so on, whereas concerns around national security are largely very masculinized, male-dominated. They also give the example of how state policies can be gendered, right? So they take us through the case of Portugal, issued passports only to men, and the dependents were expected to travel on men's passport. It is only after 1989 that women could travel, but they still needed their husband's permission, without which they could not travel abroad. And so that is something which is again, state mediated. And then of course, so the example, the case of Portugal sort of is a collusion of state policy and patriarchal authority, which carried on for a very, very long time until 1989. And then of course, the last point that I want to bring your attention to here is that the understanding of what's the private sphere and what's the public sphere and so on, right? So very often in the context of immigrants, states prefer not to intervene in family matters, right? Whereas family matters are directly linked with women's individual rights and so on, but the states are quite conservative in not doing so. We now come to the idea of engendering transnational migration. And you will see that, this idea, this concept can also be used for internal migration. So now the fundamental question that Mala and Pesa ask is that, does gender have something to do with maintaining ties, right? And the answer is yes. Women maintain ties far more densely, far more often than men do, right? And so therefore, even for immigrants, processes of adaptation, processes of assimilation, transnationalism, they are all gendered. And the question is, are gains for men and women the same? And the answer is no, they are not, because they are gendered, right? And so what Mala and Pesa do is, they take us through the gender geographies of power. Now, this is a concept, the concept of gender geographies of power, that they argue is very important. And it's very important because this is a way, for them, it's a way of doing a good gender analysis, right? So through the concept of gender geographies of power, the point is to be able to do a good gender analysis, right? So now there are 4 elements of gendered geographies of power. The first element is space, right? Is the geographical scale. This is a spatial term, and the geographical scale is supposed to capture our understanding that gender operates simultaneously on multiple social and cultural scales which are spatial, right? So, gender operates simultaneously on multiple spatial, social and cultural scales. So, for example, the body, the family, the state, gender hegemonies, counter hegemonies, right? So, then the space is very important. We need to look at it spatially. The second point is the point about social location. Now, what do they mean by social location? How is it that individuals and groups are situated in multiple hierarchies of gender, class, race, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, and so on? So, social location for them is similar to Granovetter's concept of embeddedness. Some of you may be familiar with Granovetter's work, where economic actions are embedded in social relations, right? And therefore, social location is specifically, it plots individual and group identities and agencies along multiple social hierarchies. So, for example, you could have a Moroccan immigrant in Spain. A Moroccan immigrant in Spain may occupy a low social location with regards to race, class, nationality, while simultaneously they may have a high social location in his or her home country. So, therefore, we need to take into account social location in both source and destination in this framework of gendered geographies of power. Similarly, the concept of agency is very important here. Agency, there can be various types of agency, the different degrees of agencies that people exert, that migrants exert, that needs to be taken into account. And finally, the idea of imagination and mind work also need to be taken into account. The last point here related to engendering transnational migration is about engendering remittances, right? So, we also then need to understand remittances through the lens of gender. So, what would this look like? You know, how do we imagine remittances from the lens of gender, right? So, the first thing of course is that remittances reflect power, remittances transmit power. Whoever is sending remittances, it's coming from a space of earning income and authority, and but we know that remittances are also gendered, right? So, spending patterns differ, use of remittances differ, and the fundamental question that why is it that migrants send remittances is also very gendered. Motivations for men and women can differ. Last point that I want to discuss now is that migration policy can be gendered, right? And Mala and Pesser take us through 2 examples. One is the Bracero program, which is of Mexican agriculture worker in the US, and that I'm going to discuss. And the next one is going to be a case study of Filipino migrants, right? And so let's go through each one and then try to make sense of how state policy is gendered and how migration is induced by the state for its own ends. So, coming to the Bracero program. So, this is really we're talking of a case of recruitment geography, right? And so, this is an example. It's a very simple and powerful example. Is one of agricultural worker programs which were orchestrated by governments, the US government, the Mexican government, and the Canadian government. And largely the aim of this was to deploy male farm labor in areas which had labor shortages at the beginning of the Second World War. And so in the US, these were known as the Bracero programs, and then they set into motion patterns of migration from certain towns, certain recruiter targeted towns in Mexico, towns where employers needed labor. And then these were induced. So, the state induced these migrations, And when they did this, there was a retracing of North-South colonial relations. Then they established gendered migration networks that have endured for decades. And then it's also led to the crafting of the stereotypical wetback image of the Mexican migrant as rural, male, and poor. So Marlon Pesa argued that unfortunately we don't know why governments involved saw fit to offer opportunities only to men. Can you imagine what would have happened if these migration pathways had been open to women? And so the Mexico-US migration stream would have looked completely different. And then they go on to argue that so we do know now that there were gender roles for appropriate migration for men and migration for women, and these gender roles were then radically reconfigured in the post-war environment. So while during the war, labor was in demand and women were recruited to industries and agriculture, and women surpassed all kinds of previous records as workers in agriculture and industry. When the men returned, women went back to quote unquote, as Rosie the Riveter was told, to go home, to have babies and to stay at home, right? So therefore the female workforce is also known as a latent workforce, right? It's a latent workforce which is hidden. It's available when men go to war, women are available to work. When there's excess work, women are available to work. And then similarly, once the war is over, once there's a lack of demand for work, it's the women who leave the workforce. So therefore, it is the labor market is gendered, as we saw earlier, and induced migration is also gendered, as we saw through the example of the Bracero program. I now come to the last point, and we're discussing the case study of Filipino migration, right? And so migration from Philippines is one of the most well documented migration streams of international migration, right? And the context of this migration is that, so you had the US colonial government that had built many military bases on the islands in the Philippines, and male labor was recruited into subservient roles in the navy of the mainland, right? And because Filipino male labor was recruited in these subservient roles, they were confined to these lower positions. They were considered feminine positions, and these then became a major basis for the enduring stereotype of emasculation. And on the other hand, you had the colonial government and nursing migration. So Filipino women were induced to a completely different migratory stream. This was a newly feminized profession of nursing, and so you had a very recently professionalized nursing curriculum in the US, which was exported to the colony in the early 20th century. Now, in order to modernize nursing care, lift its reputation, only certain students were sought in both countries. So, just like the American counterpart, the first Philippine nursing schools also recruited young, healthy model women from respectable Filipino families all over the country to schools in Manila, promoting both rural to urban migration that would subsequently become international migration. Now, the colonial government, as it prepared for self-rule, what it did was, in an effort to civilize, to prepare Filipinos for self-rule, they sponsored a unique educational opportunity for young Filipinos of the elite class, who would be the elite class would then go on to govern the country. And so this was the Pensionado program, and Filipinos were sent abroad to attend college in the US and to prepare them for top positions, to groom them for top positions in American established institutions in the Philippines. Now you see, this policy and their fates were carefully gendered. Men were sent to study politics, law, medicine, and on the other hand, women were expected to study home economics, social work, religion, nursing. So you see how the training is very gendered, and this is all state induced. So what happened was, after the Second World War, the Pensionado program was replaced by the exchange visitor program, and this in turn sponsored thousands of Filipino nurses to migrate, work and study in the US. So what you have is, by the 1970s, emigration became a huge nation building strategy of Ferdinand Marcos, who was the dictator. And so the country, Philippines as a nation state, benefited from exporting labor and importing remittances that largely came in dollars. And so therefore you had schools which continued to train nurses for export to North America, Europe and the Middle East. And then they were joined by the next round of migration of thousands of female domestic workers that were in demand across the globe. So this is the feminization of migration that we discussed earlier. So contemporary migration of domestic workers was facilitated by the state, licensing agencies for procedures that streamline production of a hardworking, submissive, obedient and docile domestic workers. So we spoke about how there are certain characteristics, certain female characteristics which are desirable for certain kinds of occupation in the services sector, in domestic work, right? And so therefore, you see, migration is state induced and occupations are gendered. And then people were then induced into migration rather than just volunteer for duty, as most migration theory assumes, right? So both employers and recruiters, their ideas about who's an ideal laborer for different jobs largely rests on ideas of gender, race, class, civilization, right? And you can see in the case of Philippines how for an entire country, migration was literally planned and executed by the state in such a manner that it was gendered, right? So, this example, this case study of Filipino migration in Mala and Pesa's paper is really fascinating in seeing how the state not only induces migration, but induces gendered migration, and then how over time patterns of migration change, how over time new professions are added. So first it was nursing and then domestic work, and then all of it following the same pressure by the state for migration, right? And so it is in this context that Mala and Pesa argue that, you know, when you theorize migration for individual, family, household, rational decision making as the prime origin, the prime mover of migration, or the prime reason why people are migrating, in this kind of a macro structural context of first the colonial state inducing migration of a certain kind and then the modern Filipino state inducing migration is in tension with that. So therefore, the moral of the story is that the nation state is also a very, very important unit of analysis that can and does induce migration, and that migration is very gendered. Okay, now so wrapping up this lecture, the gender lecture was divided in two parts, and you know, we covered a lot of ground. We started with the absence and invisibility of women in migration studies, then we went on to why gender matters in migration studies. After this, we discussed the various stages of women and gender gender research in migration. We spoke about the feminization of migration. We spoke about gendered labor markets. We looked at the impact of migration on female migrants and left behind women. We also specifically looked at various levels of analysis, spatial scales, the local, the national, the global. We focused on research methods in migration, specifically looking at the role of ethnographers, and we looked at some of the evidence around how gender shapes migration, how gender shapes migrant households, kinship, social networks. We discussed how children are gendered too, and their migration is also gendered. And then specifically with respect to engendering transnational migration, we looked at Mala and Pesa's framework of the gender geographies of power. And in the end, we concluded with two examples of state-induced migration, which are quite gendered. One was the Bracero program of agricultural workers from Mexico. In the end, we looked at state-induced migration. We looked at two examples of state-induced migration. The first was the Bracero program that recruited agricultural workers from Mexico to the US during the time of the Second World War. And the second was a longer look at a case study of Filipino migration and how state-induced migration is very gendered. With that, we come to the end of the two lecture series on gender and migration, and I will quickly run you through the references. Right, so like I said, Mahler and Pesser, really seminal paper on why gender matters, and this is a paper that was published in the International Migration Review in 2006. Then we also look at Helma Lutz's work on gender in the migration process, and then for the feminization of migration, we referred to Nicola Piper and Castles, De Haas and Miller's book, The Age of Migration. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.